Ironman. Chapter 3. The rush of air was something he could never totally screen out, but then again he didn't work hard at the fix either. It was almost indiscernible, as was the whine of the jets, but he was aware of everything that touched his senses in this intimately closed environment, and that was as it should be. Truth be told, Tony Stark lived the sound of air zipping past him as he reached speeds nearing Mach 5. It reminded him of the amazing thing he was doing, flying high over the Long Island Sound, in a suit of armor he had created with his own two hands. He had always had an he had always had an initiative feel for engineering. He always had an intuitive intuitive feel for engineering, and he wasn't blowing smoke when he told the board how much he liked working in research and development. His inventiveness had led him to many of the breakthroughs that kept Stark Industries miles ahead of the competition. It also preserved his life on a daily basis. Without the armor chestplate, tiny pieces of shrapnel would slice into his heart and kill him in an instant. Instead, powerful magnets kept the fragments remains of an explosive device away from the cardiac muscle and let him live. From that life-saving device had grown the rest of the armor, which he found himself endlessly refining. What Stark wore this cool fall day was Model 4, his most sophisticated to date, and he was already thinking of new modifications he could craft to upgrade its systems. It was an involuntary process, really one he could no more quit than breathing. He mentally kept a running list of things that he would execute whenever time permitted. Time, that was the thing he could not conquer. Since he had become Iron Man, he had come to realize how much society needed his armored counterpart, so various threats appeared around the world. While there seemed to be more than enough superhumans on the domestic scene, with more arriving on what appeared to be an hourly basis, it was increasingly number of international criminals that had him most concerned. From Russia, Crimson Dynamo, to China, China's Radioactive Man. Every country seemed to be experiencing an explosion of new dangers. Hell, even Latveria's current ruler was what everyone in the free world would consider a terrorist in the grand tradition of Mr. Gaddafi. Then again, that's why he was I don't think Mr. Colonel Gaddafi's a terrorist. He'd be in prison if he was a terrorist. Anyway. Then again, that's why he was an engineer and not a politician. Still, the threats continued to mount, but as the physicists taught, for every action there was an equal and opposite reaction. A villain arrived on the scene, and a hero seemed to rise up to oppose him and preserve the public good, and vice versa. Stark considered his technology and how it could be misused by countries that changed regimes with frightening regularity. Instead, he preferred using his skills and inventions himself, entrusting only a few pieces to others, lest things spiral out of control. The new shield operation looked promising, and if things were out well, he'd be happy to develop new things for them. But first, he wanted to take the measure of their leadership. Something about their executive council worried him, so the field leader became even more important in his estimation. Something bumped him out of his reverie. He turned his attention to a construction site near the Throg's Neck Bridge. A crane towered 15 stories above a group of men, and something seemed off to him. "Magnify by 10," he said softly but clearly. Instantly, the heads-up display in his peripheral vision gave him a close-up view, and once the enlarged image came into focus, he saw that support bolts on the crane had loosened. The man operating the crane was waving his arms frantically, trying to signal his co-workers that they had to scatter, but they didn't seem to hear him. Increased boot propulsion 15%, Stark said, and instantly the sound of the rushing increased perceptibly, at least to his ears, and he pointed his gauntleted hands toward directing the airflow. He cut through the sky, all the while continuing to analyze the crane's precarious situation. A brisk verbal command brought up semantics, showing the machine's design, with highlights noting its weak points, and others designating structural weak strengths which he could exploit. If it fell, he would have to catch it, and the operator, while keeping track of their debris that might fall onto the site below. Unibeam to 1370 degrees, he commanded. He rarely let the armor go that high, given the energy consumption and heat distribution, but he had little choice right now. He saw the circular lens in his chest plate begin to glow. The air around it began to waver from the heat, and display light clicked green next to his left eye, and he knew the beam was ready. Loudspeaker, he said. Another green light blinked. This is Ironman. Clear the area below. His voice, mechanized and sounding nothing like Tony Stark, rang out, and he noted with satisfaction that people were looking into the sky and pointing. Good. I've got their attention. He imagined them wondering if he was a bird or a plane, but dismissed the thought and focused on the rapidly approaching crane, which continued to tilt alarmingly. Quickly he swooped once around the entire machine to fully assess the situation, and then let loose a tightly focused beam. It tapered to a thin point as it arrived at the crane's base, and the intense heat began to melt the metal, fusing the cab to the girders on which it sat. Waves of heat blurred the scene, but the instrumentation confirmed what he thought he was watching. Hover mode, 100% stability. Iron Man seemed to float in the air as he concentrated on making certain the beam didn't shift from its target until the crane was secured to the tower's skeletal structure. Too much heat and the molten metal wouldn't support the weight, too little and the weld wouldn't be secure. Meanwhile, he was running late for his appointment. As the cab heated up, the man inside appeared to panic, so while he worked, Stark used the loudspeaker to calm him down. Once the crane was secure, he moved in. His internal sensors let him know his energy reserves were down to 83%, which would be fine for the rest of the day unless a giant lizard breathing atomic fire decided to rise from the Long Island Sound and challenge him to a few rounds. He maneuvered his jets to bring him closer to the crane's cab, then reached inside and eased out the overweight man. He was slick with sweat. Stark carefully held him away from the still cooling circular emitter in the middle of his chest. I owe you a beer, the man said, and then he let out a gasp as they dipped suddenly. Iron Man's boot jets automatically compensated for the increased load. Make it Johnny Walker Blue and you have a deal, friend, the armored hero replied. Whatever you want, Shellhead, the man agreed enthusiastically, and call me Mike. Stark cringed within his helmet. How he hated that nickname, Shellhead, but the Hulk had blurted it out some time back, and it had stuck. Like football players and movie stars, he was a bona fide celebrity, and nicknames came with the territory. To some it was a badge of honor, but Stark would have preferred to have his marketing people come up with something more flattering than leak it to the press. Well, you can't always get what you want. That was the lesson his mother had taught him long before Mick Jagger co-opted it, and times like this he was reminded of how true it was. The unlikely pair lowered to the ground and the boots shut off. They stood for a moment, then Mike held out a beefy hand. Being careful to disengage the hydraulics, Iron Man shook Mike's hand as the others cheered around them. EMTs had arrived by then, and they took the worker away to check him over while the foreman approached. Thanks for taking care of my guy, he said, then appeared up at the crane. Gonna have to dismantle that crane, though. Where you've got it welded, it's pretty much scrap metal. Good luck with that, Stark replied as he glanced at the chronometer displaying in his helmet. Well, I'd love to stay and chat, but I'm late for a meeting. With that, his boots whined softly and he rose into the air, slowly at first, then increased his speed, and each passing second, in well under a minute, the ground had disappeared below, and he was rising into the darkening clouds. As the Golden Avenger emerged atop the clouds, he saw the location of his appointment in the distance. It was an impressive sight, and one he didn't think he would ever tire of seeing. I'll read more of chapter 3 later. Thank you for listening.